So my excuse for having notes tonight is that one, I didn't know I was going to be here and I'm filling in, and two, I'm a writer. I literally don't talk to people. So bear with me. Being a writer and a storyteller feels like an important job to me, and I'm very lucky that I actually have 2 day jobs. So I get to choose what I write about because I'm not making any money off of what I write. And that's how, that choice is how I ended up writing just this past weekend about the history of the Ku Klux Klan in North Carolina. As you probably are aware, there's been a rise of white nationalist and neo-Confederate organizing around our state over the last couple years and intensified over the last couple months. So I was asking myself, well, what can we learn from history here in North Carolina? What can we learn about how we should interact with this, and if it's important that we stand up against this? And so as you can imagine, when you start researching Klan activity in North Carolina, there's no shortage of information. There was plenty of material for me to draw from. And I thought about, as I was creating this kind of lengthy and heavy piece this past weekend, I thought about how some of writing is, and some of storytelling is finding the right words, but so much of writing and storytelling is deciding what goes in and what you don't include. And that's why narrative and storytelling is important and dangerous. Because people who are crafting stories, telling stories, and controlling narratives are directing society, and who does that work and how mindfully they do that work matters. As a spoiler, so you don't have to read a really long essay about the Ku Klux Klan organizing in North Carolina, yes, it is important that we organize against them. I'm filling in for Liz Seymour, who couldn't be here tonight, who is a dear friend, and as was her father. And I know Liz because she was the founder of the Interactive Resource Center, the IRC, and I was fortunate to be able to work alongside her for several years there. And the IRC continues to be this really important place where people can have their foundational needs met, showers and a mailroom and a computer lab. But I think Liz and I shared an agreement that the other important thing that was happening at the Interactive Resource Center is that it was a space, a physical space where people with divergent narratives could be coming and interacting with each other and learning from each other and crossing paths. And that there's incredible power in that. My interest in storytelling started from a neighborhood that I lived in on the south side of Indianapolis, and I lived there for a number of years, and that's where my son was born, so it'll always be dear to my heart. That neighborhood's called Fountain Square, and it's a very poor neighborhood that's 90% first and second generation Appalachian immigrants, people who left coal jobs or coal jobs left them, and followed what's called in the Midwest the Hillbilly Highway to try to find new work in coal in Midwestern cities, including Indianapolis. And then, surprise, there weren't any jobs. So this neighborhood is going on second and now third generation with almost 40% unemployment and is very, very poor. And it's also the laughingstock of Indianapolis. People make fun of that neighborhood all the time. They call us trailer trash, and they tell a lot of stories about us, and stories about the neighborhood are on the news every single night. Stories about crime and addiction. Meth really wrecked that neighborhood in the early 2000s when I was living there. Prostitution and violence. And living there, all of those stories were true. But they weren't the only truth that was happening in that neighborhood. There were grandparents who were having birthday parties that were just glorious for their grandchildren. There were neighbors who would stay up until midnight taking parts out of their car engines and getting them into their neighbors' car engines to make sure that their neighbor's car would work so that they could get to work in the morning and not lose their jobs. There were people who were falling in love, and there were a lot of people who were falling out of love, and there were people who were celebrating births, and there were people who were mourning deaths. And that neighborhood showed me that nobody is a singular story, and there's always more narratives. We are full, round human beings, even poor people are. And so while living there, I decided, I wondered what it would look like if we told the stories from that neighborhood and tried to shift the narrative instead of having stories told about us. So I embarked on something that ended up becoming a master's thesis for a degree I've never used. And I worked to co-write stories and co-author stories about the neighborhood with all of my neighbors, and we created 50 stories in total. And what struck me is that incredible stories about phenomenal people are wonderful, but the most important stories are really common stories about common people, heard and told in new ways. And the story that stands out to me as I am in this room tonight was a story that a young man who was 19 contacted me. And he called me and said that he wanted to participate in the project. And he apparently didn't remember me, even though I know that he stole my bicycle a couple years earlier. But that was water under the bridge. And so he wanted to tell his story, and he was calling me from jail. And he was on his 3rd strike for theft, and 3 strikes in Indiana means that you're probably facing life in prison. And he was 19 years old. And he had grown up in Fountain Square, and he had lived in a series of houses around the neighborhood with his mamaw through a series of finding homes and being evicted from homes, and a cycle that I see in my own neighborhood here in Glenwood. And his mamaw had raised him because his mother had gone to prison when he was 2 years old, and he had never lived with his mother. And all 3 of his strikes were from robbing the same place. And that was the village pantry, which you could see from my front porch. Like most poor neighborhoods, we didn't have a grocery store, so it was sort of we call those stab and grabs, but I don't know what other people call them. And he had robbed that same store 3 times. And when we were trying to figure out how we were going to tell his story, he kept on going back to one thing. He said, I grew up in Fountain Square, which means that every day after school I used to go to the village pantry and get a soda pop or get a soda. I had friends who worked there over the years. This is the type of place where if you can't find someone in the neighborhood, you go there, and you'll run into them. And he said, it's important for people to know how many times I didn't rob the village pantry. And it's kind of funny, but it's also kind of true. If you think about how many times that young man went in there and made the right choice, right? To either purchase something or to get someone else to purchase something for him. And this was important for him to tell, and this is the way he wanted to tell his story. And I thought it was a really powerful thing, because what he was reminding us is that nobody is just one thing. He wasn't denying that he had robbed it 3 times, but he's not just one thing. Humans are storytelling animals. We've told stories from the beginning of time. All of our major religions are based off of narrative and story. We learn from story. We teach through story. We describe and make sense of our own lives through story, just as that young man was doing. And in our communities and in our culture, we have very few places where people can tell their stories. Increasingly, all of our media sources are controlled by the same 5 entities. Local journalists and independent journalists are fighting against the odds to stay alive. Please support Triad City Beat. In schools, I have a 12-year-old who goes to Greensboro Public Schools. In schools, kids are not encouraged to tell their stories or bring their lived experience to the table. They're teaching towards the test. And in communities like mine, where I live now and where I lived in Indianapolis, nobody's asked to tell their story. Stories are told about them. The only 2 places that people ever tell their stories is to charities or in court. And both of those are very constrained narratives that you have to fit into their box, or you're probably going to jail. And so when we talked about traveling light, the theme tonight, I thought to myself, these stories are really heavy. Like, the stories that I tell, I work at Second Harvest Food Bank in Winston-Salem, and I'm their writer, and I tell stories about the work that we do. And I used to work at the Interactive Resource Center. And these stories are really deep and really, really heavy. And so how on earth can we travel light? And I don't think that we can pare it down and say that these aren't heavy things. But what we can do is share a burden. And I think that that's what storytelling does best, is it allows us to identify common themes that link us together. And so we can both take up sides of it and travel a little bit more lightly, to your theme, Lyndon, and go a little bit further with them. And so I just want to express my appreciation over everybody's eagerness and willingness to share stories, to tell stories, and to go out and seek out and hear other people's stories to find those common themes.